A prosperous lawman offered his disabled daughter to the rancher as a cruel jest, yet he recognized her genuine worth. The scorching heat descended upon the Arizona territory like a heavy burden. Evening sunlight stretched lengthy shadows across the parched rangeland that extended endlessly in all directions, interrupted only by scattered sagebrush, wooden posts, and the far-off mesa where the mountains consumed the horizon. Eli Decker positioned himself near his livestock pen, a bundle of sharp wire wrapped around one arm, his other hand clutching worn pliers that had corroded at the joint. He had been repairing the northern boundary since dawn, tedious labor, one section at a time, each motion deliberate. His left limb trailed somewhat behind the right, rigid from a battlefield injury sustained in Tennessee nearly 2 decades past. He never voiced complaints about it. He never voiced complaints about anything. Eli resided in solitude on that property. Had been for 7 years now. He maintained livestock, several mustangs, and 2 barn felines he refused to name. Most days passed in silence. He favored them that way. Following the conflict, following the blaze that claimed his spouse and the infant they hadn't yet christened, he'd ceased seeking commotion, ceased seeking anything whatsoever. He simply awakened and labored. Consumed legumes from a vessel, sat beside the flames, rested on a narrow bed near the opening, and repeated the cycle. When he detected the cart, he remained motionless initially, simply halted, pliers dangling loosely in his grasp, head angled slightly toward the noise. A gentle rattling of timber wheels, hoofbits muffled on arid earth. He waited until it appeared, a solitary wagon drawn by one mare, ascending the slope toward his land like it possessed no haste, no genuine intent. Eli identified the gentleman before the wagon completely approached the clearing. Sheriff Mercer. His shoulders tensed. The sheriff was an individual who constantly appeared to be grinning at another's misfortune. Constructed large with a silver mustache that he groomed too precisely for this region. He wielded authority in town, but Eli had never concerned himself much with town. He owed them nothing, and they reciprocated the sentiment. That was the understanding. Eli placed down the pliers slowly and waited as the wagon rolled to a stop. Sheriff Mercer didn't leap down immediately. He drew back the leather straps, allowed the horse to settle, then rested one elbow on his thigh like a man preparing to stage something dramatic. Behind him, in the flat surface of the wagon, sat a young woman. She was erect, motionless, wrapped in a pale brown woolen covering, her spine resting against a wooden box. Her face was directed away from Eli, chin tilted slightly toward the mountains, eyes indecipherable in the brightness. Her hair was lengthy, reddish-brown, perhaps chestnut, and knotted at the tips like it hadn't encountered a brush in considerable time. The garment she wore was tan, worn thin in areas, ripped at the collar near the shoulder, loose around her chest, fitting at the middle. She wasn't attempting to conceal herself. Sheriff Mercer struck the reins against his knee and smiled broadly. "Thought I'd visit," he declared loudly enough to fill the space. "Figured you could use some companionship." Eli offered no response. The sheriff gestured toward the bed of the wagon. "Clara. My daughter. You recall her?" Eli's gaze shifted once to the girl, then returned to the sheriff. He remembered her dimly from years past, riding sidesaddle through town with lace gloves and pristine boots. But that had been before the mishap, before she vanished from public view. "Horse collapsed on her," the sheriff stated, as if it were a trivial detail. "Broke her spine cleanly. Cannot move her limbs. Not since she was 22. She's 24 presently. Physicians say she'll never walk again." Eli didn't inquire why he was being informed of this. The sheriff stretched, cracked his neck. "Reality is, she ain't much value to me like this. Costs currency. Nurses abandon their posts. And hell," he chuckled slightly, "a man like you could benefit from a woman nearby. You have nobody. She has nobody. Makes sense, doesn't it?" Still, Eli remained silent. He didn't observe Clara. Not yet. He could sense her gaze now, though heavily protected, like a trapped creature awaiting the wrong movement. That feeling of someone forcing themselves to remain still. The sheriff descended from the wagon, boots striking the dust with an arrogant thud. "No commitment. Just figured I'd do you both a kindness." Eli regarded him then, slow and steady. "You traveled all this distance to deliver me your daughter like cattle. She's nourished, she's dressed, and she still has an attractive face, if you're interested in that." Eli's jaw tensed slightly, then relaxed. He took several steps forward until he reached the side of the wagon. His limp was evident now, one leg stiff from the knee down, his steps cautious. He looked at Clara directly for the first time. Her skin was fair, but not sickly. Her cheekbones were pronounced, her mouth full, her eyes, strikingly blue, met his with something halfway between pride and silent rage. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way her hands pressed in her lap, knuckles white. "Do you wish to be here?" Eli asked. It was quiet when he said it. "Not for the sheriff. For her." She blinked, then nodded once. Not eager, just deliberate. That was sufficient. Eli turned without a word and walked toward his barn. The sheriff laughed behind him. "You really accepting her?" Just like that, Eli disregarded him, located a pair of wide cedar boards leaning beside the chicken coop, dragged them across the dirt with slow, steady pulls, positioned them from the back of the wagon to the porch steps. When he returned to the wagon, Clara was observing him, her hands still gripping the blanket across her legs. He said nothing, just reached forward, one arm behind her back, the other beneath her knees. She didn't resist. She didn't assist either. But when her weight settled against him, he felt how light she was. She had softness, still curves that pressed against his chest. But she was delicate in a way that made his grip instinctively strengthen. He carried her up the ramp, across the porch, and into the cabin. Inside was plain: a cot, a stove, a table, a few shelves, clean but used. She caught a glimpse of a small folded quilt on the bench by the fire, a rifle hanging above the mantel, a chipped enamel basin on a washstand. A life stripped down to what was necessary. He set her gently on the cot and stepped back. She adjusted the blanket herself, keeping her posture upright. Her hands lingered near her chest, subtly pulling the torn neckline closer, though not quite hiding it. He watched her for a second longer, then turned away and walked back outside. By the time he returned, the wagon was already vanishing down the hill, dust trailing behind it. Eli stood in the yard and stared for a moment. Then he went to the barn, fed the horses, mended a latch, worked until the sun dipped low and shadows took shape along the ground. He didn't speak. He didn't think about what came next. Inside, Clara sat alone on the cot. Her eyes followed the cracks in the ceiling, the grain in the wooden walls. She could hear him moving outside, quiet but steady. She took slow breaths, the kind that came when you didn't know if you were safe, but suspected you might be for the first time in a long while. She didn't know why he'd said yes. She didn't know what he wanted from her, if anything. But he hadn't looked at her legs. He hadn't winced. He hadn't touched her like others did. And somehow that was louder than anything else. The following morning emerged quietly over the ridges. The kind of stillness that belonged to places distant from thoroughfares, distant from settlements. Morning light angled across the cabin's wooden floor, particles catching the light in slender beams. Eli had been conscious for hours. He moved around the property without sound, feeding the livestock, checking the water mechanism, stacking the last of the seasoned timber inside the lean-to before the temperature could rise. His movements were steady, practiced. It was the only way he knew how to think, through action. Inside the cabin, Clara lay motionless on the cot, eyes open. She hadn't rested much. The mattress was firmer than she was accustomed to, but that wasn't what kept her wakeful. It was the stillness, genuine stillness. Not the kind that came before a door crashed or footsteps thundered across a hallway, but the kind that remained even after her breathing stilled. There were no harsh voices, no groaning floorboards, no men outside her window pretending not to peer inside, just the sound of wind through a cracked shutter and the faint creak of wood settling. She shifted on the bed as best she could, adjusting her arms beneath her to sit up straighter. The blanket had fallen partway down during the night, exposing the neckline of her dress again. She pulled it up, tucked the torn shoulder into the seam with a practiced motion. She felt her cheeks flush a little, not from shame, but from being seen yesterday, really seen, and not by choice. She wasn't used to that kind of looking. Not the kind that didn't ask or expect something. That man, Eli, he hadn't looked at her with hunger or pity, just awareness, like he saw she was there and that was sufficient. The door creaked open. Eli stepped in carrying a metal cup of water and a cracked ceramic plate with a folded piece of cornbread and some beans. He set it down on the table near her without speaking. She watched him. He didn't meet her eyes. "I can feed myself," she said. He nodded and stepped back. She took a breath, then reached for the plate. Her fingers were steady, but her body didn't shift well without assistance. She braced herself with one hand on the bed frame and managed to pull the plate onto her lap. The beans were cold. She ate them anyway. Eli sat down on the chair by the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee from the tin pot resting on the coals. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of spoons against tin and the creak of the floor under weight. "Why'd you accept me?" she asked finally, voice low, almost flat. He looked at her for the first time that morning. "You said yes," he said simply. "That's not a reason." It was sufficient. She stared at him a moment longer, trying to read something in his face, but he was hard to read. His eyes always quiet, his jaw always set. He wasn't avoiding her, but he wasn't inviting conversation either. Not coldness, more like he didn't know what to say or how. "You don't ask many questions, do you?" He shrugged slightly. "Only when I need answers." Clara nodded to herself. That made more sense than anything she'd heard from a man in years. Still, part of her didn't trust it. She had been passed between relatives and caretakers since the accident, some cruel, some careless, most just tired of her presence. When her father left her here, she expected more of the same, maybe worse. She had braced for humiliation, for rejection, for cold indifference. Instead, this man built her a ramp. She looked around the room. "Where am I supposed to, go?" "There's a shed out back," Eli said. "I built a bench inside. I can help you get there." She frowned. "So you expected me to stay?" He didn't answer that right away. "I don't do charity," he said. "If someone's here, they help. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, you'll have your place. Not as a guest." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And what is this? Some kind of trade? You feed me, what? Do laundry from a chair? Warm your bed eventually?" Eli's face didn't change. "I didn't ask for that." She stared at him, waiting for some flicker of motive, but there was nothing, no shame, no insult, no desire, just steadiness. It unnerved her more than cruelty would have. "I don't know what to do here," she muttered. "You'll figure it out," he said, then stood and walked outside. She listened to the screen door creak, then shut again. Alone now, she looked down at her lap. Her hands trembled a little. She hadn't cried since before the accident. She wouldn't now, but she felt something move under her ribs that she hadn't let in for a long time. Possibility. By mid-morning, he returned with 2 planks and a box of nails. She watched through the open doorway as he measured out a section of porch just beyond the step. He worked without speaking, sweat forming under the brim of his hat. He drove nails in with long, precise swings, knelt slow because of his bad leg, adjusted boards by feel more than sight. She wheeled herself forward in the chair he had dragged in from the barn. It wasn't made for comfort, but it moved, and it was something she could do on her own. She rolled to the edge of the porch and looked down at the work. "You built that for me?" she asked. "Wasn't going to construct one for the coop. You needed it more." She didn't smile, but her throat tightened a little. "I can wash vegetables. Clean beans. If you bring them to me." He nodded without looking up. "Good." Clara turned her chair and went back inside. Her hands trembled slightly on the wheels. Eli finished the ramp and leaned back to check the slope. He didn't say it aloud, but her offer to help mattered. Not because he needed it, he had done just fine alone, but because it meant she wasn't waiting to be rescued. That evening, they didn't speak much. She peeled potatoes. He salted pork. They ate in silence. She asked if he'd always lived alone. He said, not always, and left it at that. As the sky turned dark outside and the oil lamp flickered inside the cabin, Eli sat by the window and cleaned his knife. Clara sat in the chair by the hearth, her hair down now, her eyes soft with thought. She didn't know what tomorrow would be like. But for the first time in 2 years, no one was expecting her to disappear, and that meant something.